So there is a video game out there that, by every rule of how this stuff is supposed to work, should be dead. It was built by one guy in a bedroom at the end of the 1990s. It ran inside a web browser using a piece of software that has since been pulled off the internet completely. And over the years, almost every single thing that was supposed to finish it off actually happened to it. The company changed the way combat worked and half the players walked out. The game got accused of running a casino aimed at kids. The studio behind it got bought and sold 4 separate times. And even so, on a normal Sunday last August, more people were logged into it at the very same moment than at any other point in its 25-year history. That game is RuneScape, and the strange part is not that it survived all of that, because plenty of old games limp along with a few loyal fans. The strange part is that it should have died at least 4 separate times for 4 completely different reasons, and each time the thing that saved it was something nobody at the company had actually planned for. So this is the story of how a browser game from 2001 outlived the browser it was made for, outlived the people who owned it, and outlived basically every rival that was supposed to put it in the ground, and somehow ended up bigger right now than it has ever been. It started in the most ordinary place possible. Back in 1998, a guy named Andrew Gower was working on a little game in his parents' house in Nottingham, England, a basic multiplayer dungeon game called Devious Mud that he never even released to the public. That project turned into RuneScape, which went live on the 4th of January 2001. And the one decision that made it different from almost everything else at the time was that it ran straight inside your web browser. So you didn't buy a box, you didn't wait for a giant download, and you didn't need a powerful computer. You clicked a link and you were in. It was written in a programming language called Java, and that meant it could run on basically any machine that could open a web page, including the locked down computers in school libraries and internet cafes, which is exactly where most people first found it. That one feature, being playable anywhere with no install, is what let it spread by pure word of mouth. By the time the brothers Andrew and Paul Gower set up the company Jagex properly, with a partner named Constant Tedder at the end of 2001, the game already had over 1 million free accounts. They added a paid membership in February of 2002 for a few dollars a month, and it pulled in 5,000 subscribers in the first week, which made it one of the biggest paid Java games in the world almost overnight. About 2 years after that, in 2004, they rebuilt the whole thing with a proper 3-dimensional engine, and the growth just kept going, and it didn't stop. RuneScape ended up holding the Guinness World Record for the most popular free online role-playing game several years running. It eventually crossed 200 million registered accounts, then 250 million, and it even set 2 more world records. First one for being the most updated game of its kind, getting a new update on average about once a week for well over a decade, which by 2017 added up to more than 1,000 separate updates. It also holds a Guinness record that has nothing to do with any of that, which is for the most fish ever caught in a video game, sitting at 8 billion, and Jagex worked out that if you laid all those virtual fish head to tail, they would wrap around the planet 20 times. But the exact thing that made RuneScape spread in the first place was about to turn into the thing that should have killed it. Because the game lived inside your browser, it depended on a browser plugin to run, and that plugin was about to be killed off for good by the very companies that made it. The problem came down to how the game was actually built. RuneScape ran on something called a Java applet, which was basically a little program that loaded inside the browser through a plugin, and for years that was completely normal. But around 2015 and 2016, the people in charge of that technology, Oracle, announced they were retiring the Java browser plugin for good, and the major browsers like Chrome and Firefox dropped support for it. The same thing was happening to Flash, the other plugin that a huge chunk of the early web was built on. So the delivery system that the entire game sat on top of was being deleted from every browser on Earth, and there was nothing Jagex could do to stop it. Most games tied that tightly to dying technology would have just gone down with the ship. Instead, Jagex built a brand new downloadable client from scratch, written in a different language, and released it in April of 2016 under the codename NXT, which cut the browser out of the equation entirely. The old Java version was officially shut off at the end of 2019. So the game that became famous specifically because you could play it in a browser at school does not run in a browser at all anymore, and the browser version is simply gone for good. And oddly enough, the old Java client for the classic version version of the game limped on getting patches all the way until late 2025 and was finally killed off completely in January of 2026, partly because people kept using it to sneak around the game's defenses and cheat. Which brings up the next thing that should have wrecked the game from the inside, and that is the robots. For almost its entire life, RuneScape has been crawling with bots, which are automated programs that play the game for you, doing the boring, repetitive stuff over and over, gathering resources and in-game gold around the clock, which then gets sold to real players for real money. That whole business is called gold farming, and at its peak, it flooded the game with so many fake players that it was wrecking the in-game economy and the experience for everyone else. So on the 25th of October 2011, Jagex hit back with a project they had codenamed Cluster Flutterer, which the community ended up calling Bot Nuke Day, and the company said it wiped out about 98% of the bots in the game in one single shot and dealt a serious blow to the gold farmers. They also took the fight to court, suing the people who made the most popular botting programs. And that particular problem turned out to be incredibly stubborn because that war never actually ended. And as recently as January of 2026, 15 years later, the reason they finally pulled the plug on that old Java client was that botters were still using it. But bots were an outside attack. The thing that came closest to genuinely killing RuneScape was not an outside attack at all, because it was a series of decisions the company made completely on purpose in the same single year, and it is honestly a wonder the game came out the other side. There were two big problems, and they landed almost on top of each other in 2012. The first one was about money, because in April of that year, Jagex added a feature called the Squeal of Fortune, which was a kind of prize wheel, and they let players pay real money to spin it for a chance at in-game items and experience. A lot of the community saw that as gambling, plain and simple, and they were furious. So much so that players actually gathered together in one of the game's towns, a place called Falador, on World 66, to hold a protest, and they buried the official forums under thousands of angry posts demanding it be removed. Jagex argued it technically wasn't gambling because every single spin won you something, even if that something was nearly worthless. The wheel later got rebranded as Treasure Hunter, with keys and chests instead, which is the loot box model a lot of people would recognize today. And the worry the community had right at the start that this stuff could spiral did not come from nowhere, because years later, a report from the British Parliament about heavy spending in video games pointed at RuneScape directly after one player in the United Kingdom ran up a debt of more than £50,000, which is around $62,000 on the game. The second problem that same year was even bigger because it touched something every single player used every single day, which was combat. In November of 2012, Jagex released the evolution of combat, and for more than a decade before that, fighting in RuneScape had been simple and slow, where you clicked on a thing and your character attacked it and you could mostly sit back. The evolution of combat threw all of that out and replaced it with a fast system of special abilities and a hotbar, much more like World of Warcraft, and it was meant to modernize the game and pull in new players, but it ended up doing the exact opposite. Players left in huge numbers, in what people who lived through it still describe as a mass exodus, and the main version of the game would go on to lose more than half of its players in the years that followed. So in the space of a single year, the company managed to bolt a real money gambling wheel onto the game and then rip out and replace the one system that everybody touched constantly. By any reasonable measure, that should have been the end of the story, because you had a 12-year-old browser game hollowed out by its own update, losing players fast, and sitting on technology that was about to be banned from the internet. And then the most unlikely rescue in the whole game's history came from a dusty box of old backups. It started on the forums in early 2013 when a Jagex staffer posted a thread about how many players were openly missing the older version of the game, especially the way it had been back in 2006 and 2007 before all the big changes. So the team went digging to see if a copy that old even still existed somewhere and whether it could even be turned back on. And they described the search as going through years of dusty old backups, half joking that they mostly expected to turn up the old IT manager's collection of 80s rock music. But what they actually found was a complete working backup of the entire game as it had been on the 10th of August 2007. Rather than just switching it on and guessing whether anyone cared, Jagex put it to a vote. They ran a poll asking the players whether they wanted this old version brought back, with bigger rewards promised the more votes came in, where the lowest target of 50,000 just kept the old servers switched back on, and the top target of 750,000 meant Jagex would put a whole separate team on it for free. The vote blew past that 50,000 minimum with ease, landing at about 449,000 $110,000, which fell a little short of the $500,000 mark that was tied to charging an extra monthly fee. But Jagex decided to give the players the better deal anyway, dropping that extra fee and committing to support the game for good. They opened the servers, and the old version hit 50,000 people online within 4 hours. That is the game now known as Old School Runescape, and the choice that turned it from a nostalgia experiment into the main event was a strange one because Jagex handed control to the players. Almost nothing gets added to Old School RuneScape unless it passes a poll where at least 7 out of 10 paying players vote yes, so the community literally steers the game. Instead of a studio constantly changing things and hoping people stick around, you got the exact reverse, which is a game frozen in time and only changed with the player's permission. While all of that drama was playing out inside the game, the company itself was going through its own kind of chaos, the kind that usually means a studio is on its last legs, because Jagex got bought and sold over and over. In 2012, an investment firm called Insight Venture Partners took control for somewhere around $150 million. Then, in 2016, a group of Chinese investors bought it for a few $100 million more. Then, in 2020, an American firm called MacArthur Fortune Holding picked it up for $530 million, only to flip it less than a year later to the Carlyle Group, a giant American investment firm, in early 2021. And in 2024, it got sold yet again, this time to a private equity firm called CVC, along with another investor, in a deal reported at around £910 million, which is a bit over $1 billion. That is 5 different owners in barely more than a decade, and the price just kept climbing the whole way, from around $150 million all the way to over $1 billion. There was even a legal fight tangled up in it, where a separate company filed a complaint claiming one of those earlier sales was invalid and that they were the rightful owner of Jagex. Normally, when a game studio gets passed around between investment firms like that, with the price climbing every time, it is a sign the new owners plan to squeeze it dry and move on. And a 20-year-old game would be exactly the kind of thing that gets shut down to cut costs. Except the opposite happened, because the thing they kept buying was not winding down at all, and it was getting more valuable for a reason. The game went to phones. RuneScape came to mobile after 1.8 million people signed up before it even launched. So the same character you ran on a computer was now in your pocket on the bus. And the numbers tell the rest of it, because across its whole life, the franchise has now passed 300 million accounts and brought in more than $1.5 billion. And at the time of that last sale, it had 2.4 million paying subscribers and another million free players on top of that. But the single most ridiculous number is this. In December of 2024, Old School RuneScape, the version built from that 2007 backup, set an all-time record with about 231,000 people online at the same moment. And then on the 3rd of August 2025, on a normal Sunday, it smashed that record again with more than 240,000 players online at once, which was 12 years after this so-called old version had launched. To put that in perspective, that is roughly 8 times the player count of its own modern sibling, RuneScape 3. And if all of those players showed up on the Steam charts, Old School RuneScape would sit around the 4th most played game on the entire platform, behind only monsters like Counter-Strike and Dota, except most of its players don't launch it through Steam at all, so it barely shows up there. But we can clearly tell that the game is still massive, and so the question stands: why, even after all this, has RuneScape not died? The answer is the part that flips the whole thing around, because the reason RuneScape is alive is the exact opposite of the reason most games survive. It did not chase what was new. The version winning right now is a literal copy of the game from 2007, kept frozen on purpose, and changed only when the players themselves vote yes. The thing that was supposed to be its biggest weakness, that it was old and simple and behind the times, turned out to be the entire point. The browser that the game was built for got deleted, the combat update emptied the servers, the gambling got dragged in front of Parliament, and the studio got sold 4 times over, and none of it stuck. And the version of RuneScape pulling the biggest crowds it has ever seen is a backup from a summer day in 2007, alive today only because a few 100,000 people refused to let it go. A game that should have been dead a dozen times over is, right now, more alive than it has ever been.